Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Venezuela. These days, it's about as far from a socialist utopia that you can get, and Venezuelans are both hungry and angry. And yet President Maduro is blaming the collapse on foreign capitalists. We'll ask why this former bus driver is recklessly driving the economy off a cliff. Also this week, a win-win situation in Vietnam. Barack Obama's lifted a decades-old US arms embargo during his trip there. But it's trade where the two countries really see eye to eye. Can support for the Trans-Pacific trade deal open up new markets for Vietnam and its cheaply manufactured goods? And Forbes publishes its latest list of the world's most powerful companies, and guess what? Despite the economic slowdown, China and its banks are topping the list. So we're zeroing in on Venezuela this week, an economy that's gone from bad to worse to something even more dire. Because we're not just talking about bad economic numbers anymore, we're talking about a full and drastic spillover into real, everyday life. Inflation's spiraled out of control. The military is patrolling supermarkets because of short supplies. But there's also a lack of hard currency, which is resulting in a huge black market and an abuse of the monetary system. Look at some of the everyday impacts that we're seeing. Coca-Cola, for example, has had to shut down production because it has, quite simply, run out of sugar. The government slashed imports and private companies can't access foreign currency to buy their raw materials. Case in point, Venezuela's biggest brewer, which stopped making beer last month until it can get access to foreign currency to buy malted barley. Those might not seem the most consequential of things, but overall, according to the World Bank, Venezuela now sits only above South Sudan, Libya and Eritrea as the worst country in the world for doing business. So now, in desperation, President Maduro's turned to selling Venezuela's gold. The IMF says reserves have dropped almost a third over the past year, and when you run out of reserves, you can't pay your debts. So far, Maduro has prioritised foreign debt payments to prevent an outright default. But remember, I talked about something far more dire. That is a fully fledged humanitarian crisis, which is well on the way. Many children survive on just one meal a day, causing doctors and NGOs to warn of an increase in malnutrition. John Hausmann starts us off this week from Caracas.
Baby Bankers is cooking flour and beans again. It's all she and her 3 boys have had to eat today and every day for the past 5 months.
I feel humiliated that I can't give my sons what they deserve, just whatever's left around. It's half of what they should be eating.
They had nothing left at all until the government gave them a food bag. Her boys are constantly without vital nutrients. One has a fever now.
They're weak because there's no food. Before, the neighbours would say, your children will never get ill. But now they're starting to get sick a lot.
Food NGOs and doctors told us malnutrition is on the rise in Venezuela, especially affecting the working class young and elderly.
In the last few years, the problems got worse because it's not just about the spending power of the patient, but it's also about the availability of food, which at the moment is basically non-existent.
She's talking about the chronic shortages that mean huge queues outside supermarkets, and as products run dry, prices have soared. 1 kilo of chicken costs half baby's weekly wage. That's why she and her family haven't tasted it since December. This is what you'll typically find in the fridge of a working class family in Venezuela right now. As you can see, there's no meat here, there's no vegetables, all of that's much too expensive. The only things we can find, some pasta, some flour and some beans. And even those basic products are becoming increasingly difficult to get hold of. Since the price of oil dropped, Venezuela's struggled to import the food it needs. Added to that, regulated prices have meant many products are siphoned off into a lucrative black market, and a largely government-controlled agricultural sector is malfunctioning. Even some officials say things have to change.
The government can't centralize all of the distribution. Instead, it has to help community and farmer organizations as they decide how to go forward.
Fixing a food crisis will be a long process. For now, Baby and many more here can only concentrate on scraping together enough for their children's next meal.
What a mess it is, and a man-made mess at that. We're going to talk to Ricardo Hausmann about it. He is the director of the Center for International Development at the Harvard School of Government. He's also the former planning minister of Venezuela. Mr. Hausmann, thank you for your time. The more I look at Venezuela and the more I look at the acute, desperate situations happening right now, it looks like this economy is being intentionally run into the ground, or at the very least, no steps are being taken to arrest the slide. Is that the case?
No, that's exactly what's going on. It's a misguided economic strategy where the state is trying to take over society, control society, restrict society. And they used to be able to do that because they could run the economy on oil. And now the oil has dwindled. They have lost complete access to international finance. And the state can no longer do what it's intending to do, and it is not empowering society to solve its own problems. In the majority of countries, the government is not in charge of providing food, it's not in charge of providing medicine, it's not in charge of providing soap and toilet paper. The market does that. But in Venezuela, the market has been so clampered, so expropriated, so controlled, so restricted, that basic things that any economy is able to assure are now impossible in Venezuela.
So as much as you can tell, or as much as anyone can tell, what on earth is Nicolas Maduro doing? I mean, he's selling off gold now as he tries to pay off the debts. What do you think he is actually hoping to achieve with all these moves?
I think he's just trying to cling on. He has a misguided strategy. He's unable to change course because he has ideologically trapped himself into this situation. He's blaming a ridiculous international conspiracy for this. So how can he explain that now he has to change course if it would be sort of like accepting defeat or something? So in the end, you know, it is the biggest set of mistakes. You know, the country, it ran out of foreign exchange, but it's unwilling to restructure its debt or ask for international financial assistance. It has a fiscal deficit somewhere between 15 and 20% of GDP. This is unheard of. It is printing money as if it was going out of fashion. It is has one official exchange rate at 10, another official exchange rate at 460, and the parallel rate at 1100. So you can imagine that under those conditions, you have to sort of like put everybody in prison for people not to buy from one market and sell into the other. He's already closed the border with Colombia to prevent smuggling. He has, every time that there are shortages, he thinks of putting more people to police to make sure that people don't hoard, that people don't gauge products from one market to the other. But he's not putting anybody into production, and he's not increasing the supply of imported inputs. So this is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. The check was in the mail. So there's a complete collapse of the economy that is the consequence of this extremely misguided and crazy economic policy.
You know, sorry, it's just extraordinary listening to you list off all of those things. I'm just searching for some sort of positive there, or some sort of possible light at the end of the tunnel. Is there any that you can see there in Venezuela?
I think that, you know, man-made disasters are solved by people. And in the context of a political transition, in the context of significant international financial and humanitarian support, I think that all these wrongs, there is all this attempt to control society instead of empowering society, those things can be turned around, and the economy can recover through its society, not through government provision. And people are eager and willing to you know, earn their living by making things that other people want to buy. But that has been against the philosophy of this government. This is probably the most inept communist attempt in human history.
Ricardo Hausmann from the Harvard School of Government. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We also need a little reminder about what's led to all of this, and we're going to do that with Ruth Krivoy joining us via Skype from New York. She's the former president of the Central Bank of Venezuela, currently a partner at Global Source in Venezuela. Can you explain to us, first of all, Ruth, how things have gotten quite so bad? And it seems in quite a short space of time, there's really been this acceleration in Venezuela's economic problems.
The story starts with Venezuela's dependence on oil. And the lack of macroeconomic stabilization mechanisms and strong fiscal and monetary institutions. So Venezuela's economy has been subject to the volatilities of the price of oil, with output going up and then declining systematically since 2003. More recently, Venezuela went through a political shock with President Chavez's death in 2013, and then an oil shock when prices collapsed in 2014. So the combination of a political shock and an economic shock led the country to a transition dominated by inappropriate policies that got worse.
So what do you think can be done about the more acute problems, the inflation? You know, I went to Zimbabwe back in 2008 at the height of hyperinflation there, and it just got ridiculous. Prices were so out of control. And Venezuela is starting to sound almost the same, if not worse. Can anything be done more immediately to ease that?
There is hardly a quick fix for hyperinflation because it's not a matter of tweaking a foreign exchange system or trying to prevent money supply from growing exponentially. It also means you have to reestablish credibility and you have to reestablish some kind of anchors for expectations. And at the moment, Venezuela lacks fiscal anchors, monetary anchors, foreign exchange anchors, inflation anchors, and credibility. So the key is to get a policy framework in place that reestablishes credibility.
And what actual chance of that? I mean, given everything you've described to me already, I wonder what realistic chance there is of that, especially when you've got President Maduro, busy preparing the army for some sort of outside threat, which he feels is coming.
It needs basically a policy overhaul. And that must come with a political regime that feeds credibility into this change. Because if changes occur, and people don't believe that they will be sustainable, as we have learned from many countries around the world, things don't work. And there will be several attempts, unfortunately, until something works.
Ruth Krivoy, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And we'll be back in Latin America a little later in the program. Cuba, which is all set to legalize thousands of small and medium-sized businesses to kickstart the economy. Later, we'll take a look at Cuba's tech startups waiting for their revolution. Right now, though, the annual Forbes Global 2000 list, that is the world's largest and most influential companies. And when you're talking large and influential these days, you're talking China. Despite the slowing economy, Chinese companies have once again topped the list. 3 Chinese banks held their positions among the top 5, that is Bank of China, China Construction Bank and the Agricultural Bank of China. And in a sign of the way the US economy has picked up since the dark days of the credit crisis, a number of American banks have climbed up into the top 15 in the world. Well, joining us from London to talk about this is Robert Haig, Marketing Director at Brand Finance. And the first thing we obviously notice is straight off the bat is that there are all these Chinese companies in the top 10 and a lot of Chinese banks in there specifically. Isn't this the ultimate confirmation that China has fully embraced capitalism? It is still technically a communist country, but really it's as capitalist as you can get, isn't it?
Well, that's absolutely right. And one thing that's really changed in China in the last few years is their focus on brands in particular. It's no longer that they're just exporting to the world by being a manufacturing powerhouse or even focusing exclusively on their own domestic economy. they're investing very heavily in branding so that they can eventually capture markets all over the world. And that's why Chinese bank brands and Chinese brands across the board are doing so well.
What's the power of a Chinese bank brand, though? You know, when you look at that list, they're not exactly recognizable. They're not the Merrill Lynch's and the Goldman Sachs's or anything like that. Is there some growing strength behind these brands, internationally speaking?
There absolutely is. I mean, they may not be well known in the West or even particularly well known in other parts of the world outside China yet. But one thing that Brand Finance has noticed with its own bank branding research is that Chinese consumers have a particularly strong affinity with their own brands, and they have a slightly different relationship than many consumers in the West do. So a lot of our third-party research that we use in our Banking 500 survey suggests that there's a far lower degree of skepticism amongst Chinese consumers, which means that their bank brands and banks in general and brands in general are very, very successful and very strong in terms of brand equity.
So let's have a look at some of the others that are in there. I've got the list here. No surprise to see Apple at number 8. Samsung is at number 18. I thought there might be a bit more tech, actually, but clearly there's still ones to watch.
Yes, that's absolutely true. What we've seen is that tech brands are almost without fail amongst the fastest growing brands over the last 5 to 10 years. So speaking again about China, we've seen brands such as Baidu, WeChat, Huawei, etc., showing some of the fastest rates of growth. But then you only have to look at some of the big Silicon Valley success stories to see similar rates of growth. So, for example, despite their recent worries about user growth, Twitter is growing very quickly. Facebook continues to grow very quickly. Google, and then of course Apple being the most valuable brand in the world.
Yeah. So business strength like this and brand strength, is this sort of the way of the future? In your first answer in this interview, you talked about China not just being a big economy, it is these big companies as well. So, I'm wondering maybe this is the way forward for these countries. You push your economy and you push what it has to offer, but you do it through your big corporates.
Yes, well, it's really a symbiotic relationship because on the one hand, the company brand is a very powerful tool for helping corporates to succeed. So, for example, the US and the Californian regional brand in particular helps to lend credibility and financing to startups, for example. But then on the other hand, corporates can build the reputation of a country or the region in which they're based. So it sort of flows both ways.
Right. Robert Hay talking brand strength with us this week. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And just while we're talking big business, there's a bit of concern about a potential mega merger in the agriculture sector. You've got Germany's Bayer, the world's second biggest maker of crop chemicals, making a $62 billion play for US-based Monsanto, the world's biggest supplier of genetically modified seeds. It's not the only deal in the agribusiness space. ChemChina plans to buy Switzerland's Syngenta for $43 billion, and Dow Chemical and DuPont are also forging a $130 billion joint business. But it's this Bayer-Monsanto tie-up where the concern lies. It's the biggest all-cash offer on record, even though Monsanto turned it down, saying it's not enough. But imagine the impact of it. Our global agricultural system potentially depending on just a few companies. Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, Dow, Monsanto, DuPont. These 6 companies control 60% of commercial seed and more than 75% of agrochemical markets. We'll watch this space and report back as it develops. To Vietnam now, where Barack Obama made a 3-day visit. On the face of it, it was about lifting an arms embargo and strengthening Vietnam's military. But really, it's trade which binds the US and Vietnam. It is actually the largest US trading partner in Southeast Asia, with bilateral trade hitting $45 billion last year. Marga Ortigas now with more on the economic ties which bind.
The traditional art of water puppetry keeps Vietnam's stories of the past alive. One of the most well-known tales is that of the country as represented by a dragon rising from the depths of darkness. It's a story that resonates with many people in Vietnam today. It's been 30 years since the communist state opened up its market, and now the economy is set to soar. Workers like those at this garment factory have high hopes as their export market expands with the implementation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the largest free trade pact in the world.
For all free trade agreements, the core factor is tax reduction. When tax reduction is applied, goods will be exchanged freely. This will create lots of business opportunities for us.
But it will also be challenging. A lot of capital and technological investment is needed for Vietnam to keep up with the US-led TPP's standards. It's the least developed of the 12 countries that signed the deal, but the US is vowing to help Vietnam comply.
President Barack Obama is in Vietnam to cement U.S. commitment to working with its one-time enemy on all aspects of development. Vietnam is vital to Obama's Rebalance the Asia strategy. And now, with the lifting of the arms embargo, the two countries' relationship is at a landmark high.
On his second day in Vietnam, President Obama goes from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City, the country's financial center. He's combined paying tribute to Vietnam's cultural traditions with highlighting its expanding commercial enterprise, all the while underscoring the importance of human rights to economic progress.
Ultimately, it's up to the Vietnamese people to determine how their society functions and the nature of their government. But we do believe in certain universal values, and it's important for us to speak out on behalf of those values wherever we go.
There is much optimism here, and some economists predict annual growth rate could hit double digits.
So with the United States, 40 years after the war, the relationship reaching this peak is nothing unusual. It shows the true nature of our people towards countries that were enemies, that we were ready to leave the past behind and look to the future.
At the puppet shows, stories of resilience and triumph continue to be told. Just out of sight, people work together to pull the strings, making the dragon rise out of the water.
Finally this week, Cuba and its continued economic reformation. Now, in the rest of the world, a small or medium-sized enterprise would be completely normal, right? But in Cuba, they're only just becoming legal. Less than a decade ago, it was illegal to buy a computer. And even now, internet access is limited and pricey. But is that stopping the tech-savvy Cuban youth? Andy Gallagher went to Havana to find out.
Havana is famous for its classic cars, architecture and colourful streets. It's a city that moves to its own distinctive beat. And when it comes to modern technology, Cuba is no Silicon Valley. Getting online here is an expensive, time-consuming ordeal. Public hotspots are now more common, but very few Cubans have internet access in their homes. Nonetheless, a growing number of digital entrepreneurs are changing Cuba's online image. Indira Sotillo Fernandez is one of those behind Isla Dentro, a restaurant review app that works both on and offline. Its success led to her meeting the US president, who recently visited Havana. She'd like to keep improving the service.
Necesitamos que sea una herramienta.
People who live here find our app indispensable and they use it on a daily basis. But we want that to be the same for those visiting from abroad. We'd like to see Isla Dentro become a tool for tourists so they can get to know our country better.
Interest and investment from the US may help speed the pace of change.
Where places where people could develop efficiently the technology.
Eduardo Antonio Rodriguez is one of Cuba's online pioneers.
En realidad, el uso de la tecnología en Cuba.
He says the normalization process with the US has led to new partnerships and new possibilities, all changes that could encourage Cuba's brightest minds to stay put.
Many of them, perhaps, if these changes hadn't taken place, would have just opted to come to the United States like thousands others do on a yearly basis. They're opting to stay there and to build a future there, and I think that that's important.
The reason that US educational institutions and businesses are investing in Cuba isn't because this island is some kind of charity case with poor access to the internet. It's because despite the odds, entrepreneurs here manage to produce good, useful technology, and that in the long run could make them a wise investment. It's estimated only a third of Cubans have access to the internet, and for many it remains out of reach. But the normalization process between the US and Cuba may help start a tech revolution.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page with individual reports, links and entire episodes to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or just drop us an email. Counting the Cost at aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.